My name is Nora, and if you're sitting down with a fresh mug of coffee right now, I want you to take a deep, slow breath. Fill your lungs completely. Feel how effortless it is, how quiet, how entirely natural. For a long time, I didn't know what that felt like. I didn't know what it was like to breathe without weighing the cost of the air I was taking up. Because in my family, having a need, even a physical, biological need like oxygen, was treated as a massive social inconvenience. It was seen as a personal flaw, an act of defiance, or worse, a desperate cry for attention. Have you ever felt like background noise at someone else's celebration? Like you were just a piece of the furniture, expected to hold up the weight of everyone else's happiness while slowly cracking underneath it? If you have, then you already know exactly how this story begins. It was a beautiful Saturday evening in late June. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting a perfect golden hour glow across my mother's meticulously manicured backyard garden. The air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine, expensive catering, and the faint, crisp bubble of high-end champagne. We were celebrating my younger sister Clara's engagement. It was the kind of elite, white-linen event that my mother, Eleanor, lived for. She was a prominent local event planner, and to her, this wasn't just a family milestone. This was a living, breathing advertisement for her business. Everything had to be flawless. Every candle had to be perfectly aligned, every glass polished to a high shine, and every family member perfectly scripted. I was standing near the outdoor bar, holding a heavy silver tray loaded with crystal champagne flutes. My job, as it always was during my mother's events, was to be the invisible logistical engine. I wasn't an honored guest, I was unpaid reliable labor. And then, without warning, the air inside my chest simply stopped moving. It didn't start with a dramatic cough. It started with a cold, terrifying tightness right behind my breastbone, like a leather strap being pulled tight around my ribs. I tried to inhale, but my lungs felt completely rigid, like old, dried leather. The sound of clinking glasses, the soft jazz playing through the garden speakers, and the loud, booming laughter of Clara's new fiancé all began to twist together, warping into a strange, distant echo. The garden tilted. I gripped the edge of the brick bar with one hand, desperately trying to keep the heavy silver tray steady with the other. My throat felt like it was closing down to the width of a straw. Panic, hot and sharp, crawled up my neck. I forced a rigid plastic smile onto my face because I knew the rules. Rule number 1 in our house: never, under any circumstances, disrupt the aesthetic. I caught my mother's eye from across the lawn. She was wearing a stunning ice blue silk dress gliding through the crowd like a queen checking her court. When she noticed me swaying, her smile didn't fade, but her eyes hardened instantly. She excused herself from a group of wealthy city officials and glided toward me with terrifying speed. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't look at the sweat breaking out along my hairline or the way my fingers were turning a dangerous pale shade of gray as I gripped the silver tray. She leaned in close, pretending to help me adjust the champagne glasses, and hissed directly into my ear, her voice a sharp, venomous whisper. "Enough of the drama, Nora. Stop ruining your sister's night with this pathetic performance. Put those glasses down. Get away from the main guests and go clean up the back catering station." Now. I tried to answer her. I opened my mouth to tell her that I literally couldn't feel my fingers, that my vision was tunneling into a tiny black circle. But my voice didn't work. All that came out was a thin, broken whistle of failing air. She didn't care. She turned her back on me, her silk dress rustling softly, and walked right back into the crowd to laugh at a joke she hadn't heard. I did exactly what I had been trained to do since I was a little girl. I obeyed. I carefully set the heavy silver tray down on the edge of the brick bar, ensuring not a single crystal glass clinked loudly enough to disrupt the nearby conversation. My legs felt like they were made of water, trembling so violently that each step across the manicured lawn felt like walking through a deep swamp. I moved away from the laughing clusters of family friends, away from the glittering fairy lights, and slipped into the shadows near the back catering station behind the detached garage. The air out here was slightly cooler, but it didn't matter. My lungs had completely locked up. I reached down to unzip my small leather handbag, my clumsy, numb fingers tearing at the zipper. My heart was pounding a frantic, erratic rhythm against my ribs, a suffocating thud that sounded like a trapped animal trying to break through a wall. I reached inside the bag, searching for the familiar, smooth plastic cylinder of my emergency rescue inhaler. It wasn't there. I turned the bag upside down, dumping my wallet, my keys, and my lip gloss onto a plastic folding table. Nothing. My throat constricted further, a terrifying wave of panic washing over me as I realized exactly what had happened. Earlier that afternoon, while I was setting up the linen tablecloths, my mother had walked into the staging area, critiquing the clutter of my personal belongings. She had taken my bag, claiming she was going to hide it away so it wouldn't ruin the background of her setup. In her clinical, obsessive drive to curate a perfect aesthetic, she had cleaned out what she deemed unnecessary items to make the small bag sit completely flat. She had confiscated my lifeline, tossing it onto a counter inside the house, completely blind, or perhaps completely indifferent, to the fact that she was stripping away my ability to survive. If you're watching this right now, and you've ever had to suppress a basic, fundamental human need just to keep the peace in your own household, do me a favor. Pause for a second and type the word batteries in the comments down below. I want to see how many of us have been forced to minimize our own pain just to accommodate someone else's comfort. Because in that dark corner of the yard, I realized my family had spent a lifetime teaching me a deeply toxic lesson. Your suffering is only acceptable if it doesn't make a sound. My mind slipped backward, entirely against my will, dragged down by the familiar weight of old trauma. I was 12 years old, sitting in the back seat of my mother's sedan, coughing so violently from a sudden allergy flare-up that my ribs ached. My mother didn't reach for medicine. Instead, she reached for the power window buttons, rolling them all the way up to protect her fresh salon blowout from the humid wind before looking in the rearview mirror to snap. "Breathe quietly, Nora. You're giving me a headache." That short, parasitic memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. I collapsed onto my knees against the damp grass behind the garage, my hands clawing at the dirt. The world was narrowing down to a tiny, vibrating pinpoint of light. I was 26 years old, yet I was still that same little girl, hiding my blood, hiding my tears, hiding my failing breath, because making a scene was the ultimate sin in our family. I closed my eyes, listening to the distant, muffled sound of my sister Clara clinking her glass, getting ready to make her big speech, while I prepared to quietly slip away into the dark. To understand why I was kneeling in the dirt, fighting a losing battle for a single scrap of air, you have to understand the brilliant, terrifying architecture of my mother's mind. Eleanor wasn't a cartoon villain. She didn't scream, she didn't throw things, and she never left a physical bruise. Her cruelty was far more sophisticated than that. As one of the most sought-after luxury event planners in the city, she was a master of psychological leverage. She knew exactly how to construct an environment where her dominance looked like grace, and my submission looked like family loyalty. In Eleanor's grand design, every family member had a strict corporate function. My younger sister, Clara, was the asset. She was beautiful, effortlessly charismatic, and had just secured a high-profile engagement to the son of a prominent real estate mogul. Clara was the glittering trophy my mother could parade in front of her clients. I, on the other hand, was the infrastructure. I was the one who stayed up until 2 in the morning cross-referencing guest lists, the one who carried the heavy boxes of decor, the one who solved every logistical nightmare behind the scenes. I was highly useful, but I was never, not for a single moment, truly wanted. And because I was the infrastructure, I wasn't allowed to have defects. A chronic illness, like severe allergy-induced asthma, didn't fit into Eleanor's marketing strategy. To her, my medical needs were nothing more than a structural flaw in her presentation, a dynamic she had successfully conditioned Clara and my father, Richard, to accept as absolute truth. But her carefully constructed design forgot to account for one single variable: the outside world. As my cheek pressed against the cold grass and my vision began to fade into a featureless gray, a sharp, authoritative voice suddenly shattered the distant hum of the party. "Hey, drop those crates! Look at her, she's turning blue!" It was Julian. He was the outside catering manager my mother had hired to oversee the service staff. He was a tall, quiet man in his late 30s who usually kept his head down, but before he took over his family's catering business, Julian had spent nearly a decade working as a city paramedic. He didn't know the unwritten rules of our household. He didn't know that Nora's pain was supposed to be invisible. Within 3 seconds, Julian was on his knees beside me. His large, steady hands didn't hesitate. He dropped a heavy tray of appetizers into the mud, completely disregarding the pristine presentation, and pressed 2 fingers firmly against my carotid artery. "Nora, look at me," he commanded, his voice carrying the calm, absolute authority of someone who had pulled hundreds of people back from the edge. "Don't try to talk. Just focus on the sound of my voice. Your airway is severely compromised." I tried to blink, but my eyelids felt like lead. From the distant patio, I could hear my mother's voice, laughing elegantly, completely oblivious to the fact that the curtain was about to rise on a reality she couldn't control. Julian turned toward one of his kitchen staffers, his jaw clenched, and roared a command that cut through the soft jazz and the elegant chatter of the garden like a chainsaw. "Call 911 right now. Tell them we have a 26-year-old female in acute respiratory distress. Anaphylactic shock or severe bronchospasm. Tell them to hurry." For one incredible, terrifying second, the entire backyard went dead silent. The clinking of crystal stopped. The laughter evaporated. And for the first time in my entire life, the secret suffocating reality of my existence was pulled kicking and screaming into the light. The silence that followed Julian's roar didn't last long, but it was long enough for me to see my family's true colors in sharp, terrifying high definition. The illusion of the perfect garden engagement was shattered. From my place on the grass, I watched my mother approach. She didn't run. Running would look like a panic, and Eleanor didn't panic. She managed. She glided down the stone steps toward the back catering station, her ice blue silk dress catching the light, her face a mask of smooth, practiced concern. My father, Richard, followed a few steps behind her, his arms crossed over his chest, looking more annoyed by the disruption than worried about his daughter. Clara stood by the patio, holding her fiancé's hand, her face twisted into a pout because her big announcement had been interrupted. Eleanor reached us and immediately took a calculated look around, assessing the damage to her reputation. 2 prominent city council members and a local journalist were standing near the rose bushes, watching the scene unfold. Instead of kneeling in the dirt with me, instead of taking my freezing hand, my mother adjusted her posture, turned to the gathering crowd of guests, and deployed a chillingly soft, manipulative tone. Everyone, please. There's no need to alarm yourselves, she said, her voice carrying that perfect, soothing melody she used whenever an event venue suffered a power outage or a catering delay. She offered a fragile maternal smile that looked incredibly convincing to anyone who didn't know her. Our sweet Nora has always struggled with her emotions. She gets these severe panic episodes whenever she's overwhelmed by large crowds or when the attention shifts away from her. It's a habit she's had since childhood. My father stepped in right on cue, nodding his head in agreement to validate the script. She's right, Nora, stand up. You're making a massive scene over nothing. Your sister has been working toward this night for months, and you just couldn't let her have it, could you? Stop being lazy and dramatic. Get up. The psychological weight of their gaslighting felt heavier than the physical pressure on my lungs. They were rewriting my medical emergency right in front of my eyes, turning my desperate fight for survival into a pathetic, selfish bid for attention. They were telling the world that my body was lying, that I was unstable, all to protect the pristine PR of a backyard party. If you've ever had your reality completely twisted by a narcissist who wanted to make you look like the problem, you know the absolute despair that washes over you in that moment. You start to question your own sanity. But before my mind could succumb to the familiar trap of their guilt, Julian shifted his weight, standing directly between my parents and my collapsing body. With all due respect, Julian said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, icy register that cut right through my mother's polished tone. I don't care about your family drama. I care about clinical facts. Her trachea is deviating, her oxygen saturation is plummeting, and if we don't get an advanced airway in her within the next 10 minutes, your daughter isn't going to have a panic attack. She's going to suffer a respiratory arrest right here on your perfect lawn. My mother's maternal smile faltered, her jaw tightening as she realized that for the first time in her life, she had encountered a witness who refused to read from her script. The high, piercing wail of the sirens began to echo down our quiet, tree-lined street, growing louder and more frantic with every second. To anyone else, that sound represents rescue. But as I lay there on the grass, watching the flashing red and blue lights cut through the elegant evening shadows, all I could feel was a crushing sense of dread. I knew the rules of Eleanor's world. The only thing worse than suffering in her house was exposing that suffering to the neighbors. The ambulance pulled directly onto the gravel driveways, its tires crunching loudly. 2 paramedics burst through the side gate, carrying heavy trauma bags and a rolled-up stretcher. The party guests parted like the Red Sea, murmuring nervously behind their wine glasses. Before the medics could even reach my side, my mother intercepted them. She didn't let them do their job. She glided into their path, her hands raised in a delicate, fluttering gesture of elegant distress. "Oh, thank goodness you're here," she sighed, her voice perfectly pitched to project the image of a long-suffering, exhausted saint of a mother. Our daughter, Nora, has had another one of her catastrophic emotional breakdowns. She gets so incredibly overwhelmed when she isn't the center of attention. We tried to get her to breathe, but she just insists on carrying out these public spectacles. I am so deeply sorry our family wasted city resources on a panic attack. The lead paramedic, a tired-looking woman with a clipboard, glanced down at me, clearly starting to buy into the narrative. In their line of work, they see a lot of hyperventilation, and a polished, wealthy mother explaining a history of anxiety is a very easy story to believe. But Julian didn't let her write the final draft. He stepped forward, his posture rigid and unyielding, completely blocking my mother out of the frame. "I'm Julian. I'm a former city medic, badge 4412, he stated clearly, using the precise, clinical language that instantly changed the energy in the yard. The mother's assessment is completely incorrect. The patient is in acute respiratory failure. Her oxygen saturation is resting at 82% on a manual pulse oximeter. Her trachea is showing signs of shifting due to extreme accessory muscle use, and her family has spent the last 15 minutes actively delaying care and verbally berating her while she suffocated. The lead paramedic's eyes widened. The clipboard dropped to her side. The casual, routine energy evaporated instantly, replaced by the sharp, focused panic of a true medical emergency. "Get the high-flow oxygen now," she shouted to her partner. "We need an IV line established and prep an epinephrine auto-injector just in case this is a closed airway anaphylactic reaction. Move!" Suddenly, the pristine backyard looked like a battlefield. Sterile plastic packaging was ripped open, dropping onto my mother's prized rosebushes. A cold, rubber mask was strapped over my face, blasting freezing, dry oxygen down my throat. Wires were violently attached to my chest, a machine beginning to emit a frantic, high-pitched beep that matched the terrified racing of my heart. As they lifted me onto the hard plastic stretcher, my head rolled back and I caught one last glimpse of my family. Clara was looking at her phone, deeply annoyed that the flashing lights were ruining the lighting for her engagement photos. My father was staring at the ground, refusing to meet my eyes because the humiliation of having emergency vehicles in his driveway was too much to bear. And my mother? Eleanor was standing near the buffet table, smoothly rearranging a platter of salmon crostini, already whispering to a city councilman that I would be just fine once the cameras left. As the ambulance doors slammed shut, cutting off the noise of the party, the world narrowed down to the sterile smell of rubbing alcohol and the steady hum of oxygen. I looked out the small back window as we sped away, a single devastating thought burning through my mind. My family didn't just fail to save me tonight. They would have happily let me die in the dark, just to make sure their party ended with a round of applause. The emergency room was a stark contrast to my mother's meticulously staged garden. There were no fairy lights here, no white linens, no curated smiles. There was only the harsh, buzzing glare of fluorescent lights, the rhythmic, metallic pinging of heart monitors, and the cold, unvarnished truth. A team of nurses and an emergency room physician named Dr. Evans moved around my bed with a quiet, synchronized efficiency. They administered intravenous medications that slowly forced my restricted bronchial tubes to widen, allowing a rush of cool, beautiful air to finally flood my starved lungs. For the first time in hours, my chest rose and fell normally. The physical agony was receding, but the psychological fog was just beginning to clear. Dr. Evans pulled a rolling stool up to my bedside, his expression kind but deeply serious. He looked at my chart, then looked directly into my eyes. "Nora, the medication is working and your oxygen levels are stabilizing. But I need to be entirely honest with you. This wasn't a panic attack. You experienced a severe, near-fatal bronchospasm. Your airway was physically closing. If that catering manager hadn't forced our team to bypass the family's narrative, you wouldn't have made it to this hospital alive." Hearing a medical professional validate my physical reality felt like a dam breaking inside my soul. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't dramatic. I wasn't a liar. My family had spent a lifetime trying to convince me that my body was broken and my mind was unstable, simply because it was easier for them to pathologize my pain than to care for me. The realization hit me with terrifying clarity. Their gaslighting wasn't just a toxic behavioral trait. It was an active threat to my survival. As I lay there, watching the IV drip slowly empty into my vein, a profound shift occurred within me. The old Nora, the passive girl who always apologized for being an inconvenience, quietly died in that hospital bed. In her place, a cold, sharp strategist was born. I picked up my smartphone from the bedside table. My fingers were still trembling slightly, but my mind was completely steady. I logged into my hospital's patient portal, a shared digital system my mother had demanded access to years ago under the guise of keeping track of my health. I knew exactly what she had been doing. She had been monitoring my appointments, downplaying my diagnoses to our extended family, and altering my narrative to keep me dependent. Memories drifted into my mind, sharp and toxic. I was 19 years old, staring at a family group chat notification on my phone. My mother had texted everyone that I was skipping our grandmother's funeral due to an emotional tantrum, completely omitting the fact that I was actively hooked up to an oxygen monitor in a clinic 3 towns over. I wasn't going to let her write my medical history anymore. I called the hospital's patient advocate directly from my bedside. Within 10 minutes, a representative walked into my room with a tablet. With 3 firm taps of my finger, I legally revoked all family access to my digital records. I completely severed my mother's medical power of attorney, changed my emergency contacts to Julian and a trusted childhood friend, and password-protected my chart with a security phrase my family could never guess. I was building a digital firewall around my life, locking my mother out of the sanctuary of my health. And just as the final form was submitted, my phone lit up with a text notification from my father. "We are downstairs in the lobby. Your mother is distraught. Get ready to fix this." My parents didn't rush into my hospital room with tears of relief. They didn't burst through the doors to hold my hand or ask the nurses what the prognosis was. When the door finally swung open, my mother walked in first, her posture completely rigid, her ice blue silk dress slightly wrinkled at the waist. She had spent the last 2 hours sitting in a sterile waiting room, but her lipstick was still immaculately applied, and her hair was perfectly in place. My father followed closely behind her, his face a dark, furious mask of quiet irritation, holding a small plastic bag from the hospital gift shop, like a prop, to show they had fulfilled their parental duties. Eleanor didn't close the door behind her. She kept it slightly ajar, her eyes instantly darting to the nurse's station, visible through the glass pane. She was calculating her audience, even in the middle of an emergency department. She walked over to the side of my bed, her hands outstretched, her voice instantly dropping into a fragile, trembling tone that sounded devastatingly sorrowful. "Oh, my poor, sweet Nora!" she cried, her voice carrying just loudly enough to echo into the hallway. "You completely terrified us. Your poor sister's engagement dinner was thrown into absolute chaos because of this sudden episode." The city council members were so deeply uncomfortable. I didn't answer her. I didn't smile, and I didn't offer the familiar, comforting apologies that she usually extracted from me whenever I inconvenienced her. I just stared at her, my breathing steady and deep, my eyes completely cold. When she realized her performance wasn't getting a response, her outstretched hands slowly dropped to her sides. Her sorrowful expression evaporated in an instant, replaced by a cold, sharp, and highly transactional stare. She reached into her expensive leather designer handbag and pulled out a neatly folded piece of heavy cream paper. "Your father and I have already handled the public relations aspect of this little disruption," she said, her voice dropping into her signature corporate pitch, completely devoid of any maternal warmth. "One of the city officials at the dinner happens to sit on the charitable board of this very hospital. We've already spoken with him. We've drafted a beautiful, unified family statement for social media and the local papers. It explains that you suffered a brief, minor panic attack due to a change in your prescription and that our family handled it beautifully together." I just need you to look this over and sign your consent so the hospital's media liaison can release it." My father stepped closer to the bed, tossing the plastic gift shop bag onto my food tray. "Sign it, Nora," he commanded, his voice low and threatening. "Your mother's business reputation is on the line. Clara's future in-laws are deeply traditional people, and they are already questioning the emotional stability of our household. We cannot have the community thinking we are a broken family because you couldn't control your nerves." I looked down at the cream paper. They didn't want me to heal. They wanted me to sign a legal waiver that minimized my near-death experience so their business wouldn't lose a single corporate client. They needed me to pretend my lungs hadn't physically closed up, all to protect my mother's curated aesthetic. But they didn't know that my phone was sitting flat on the bedside table right next to the gift shop bag. And they didn't see that before they even entered the room. I had quietly opened a voice recorder application, and the little digital wave on the screen was smoothly capturing every single transactional, cold-hearted word falling from their lips. They thought they were successfully cornering a vulnerable girl in a hospital gown. They had no idea they were actively dictating the evidence that would destroy their leverage forever. The next morning, the hospital felt different. The urgent, frantic energy of the emergency room had faded into the quiet, professional hum of the recovery floor. Nurse Marisol, a senior floor nurse with a kind face and an unshakable demeanor, walked into my room carrying a small clipboard. "Nora, your vitals are absolutely perfect this morning," she said, her voice a soothing contrast to the cold demands of the night before. "The doctor has signed off on your discharge, but before I hand you these papers, I need to know something. We have a security note on your file. Do you feel safe leaving this facility, and do you feel safe returning to the environment you came from?" I looked at the clinical discharge summary resting on my lap. Right there, under the section labeled Discharge Instructions, the doctor had typed out an explicit, legally binding recommendation. Patient requires strict isolation from known domestic stressors to prevent acute somatic triggers. "No," I said, my voice quiet but entirely steady. "I don't feel safe with them, and I'm not going back." Nurse Marisol nodded, her expression softening with immediate understanding. "Then you don't have to. Let's get you moved to the sunlit lounge down the hall while your transport arrives. It's quiet there." She helped me disconnect from the remaining monitors and led me down the bright, wide corridor to the hospital's common area. The lounge had massive floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city, filled with rows of green potted plants. It was peaceful, but that peace lasted for exactly 10 minutes. The heavy glass doors of the common lounge swung open with a sharp click. I stiffened as my family marched into the room. They hadn't gone home. They had simply waited in the shadows of the hospital, tracking my discharge time. My mother walked in first, her eyes wide and red, though her makeup was perfectly restored. Clara followed, her arms crossed, looking deeply resentful that her engagement week was still being overshadowed. My father brought up the rear, his face flushed with an angry, dangerous red. "Unbelievable!" Clara scoffed loudly, completely ignoring the fact that two other recovering patients were sitting across the room. "She gets a luxury hospital vacation while Mom's business reputation is being dragged through the mud by the catering staff." My father stepped into my space, pointing a rigid finger at my face. "Nora, enough of this ridiculous little game. The hospital staff told us you altered your emergency contact file. You are going to sign that social media release right now, and you are going to get in our car. We are going home as a family, and we are going to fix the damage you caused last night." My mother stepped forward, her voice dropping into that trembling public performance of sorrow. Nora, please. Think of what people are saying. I sacrificed my entire career to build a life for you girls. How can you be this cruel to your own mother over a simple misunderstanding in the kitchen? I stood up from my chair slowly. I didn't tremble. I didn't cry. I looked at my sister, whose entire world revolved around a curated image. I looked at my father, who used intimidation to keep me quiet. And finally, I looked directly into my mother's eyes. It wasn't a misunderstanding, Eleanor, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent lounge. And I am done making your cruelty sound smaller just so you can sleep better at night. My mother recoiled as if I had struck her. How dare you speak to me like that in public? She whispered harshly, her eyes darting nervously toward the nurse's station. You took my rescue inhaler out of my bag because it ruined the aesthetic of your kitchen island. I stated clearly, every word landing with absolute, unyielding weight. You watched me suffocate on your lawn, and instead of calling for help, you told your guests I was having a tantrum because I was jealous of my sister. You stood by and let me fight for my breath because my dying was less important to you than a bad review on your business page. Nora, shut your mouth! My father barked, stepping forward to grab my arm. But before his hand could make contact, Nurse Marisol and two large hospital security guards stepped directly into his path. Sir, step away from the patient immediately, the lead security officer commanded, his hand resting firmly on his belt. I pulled out my phone, tapped the screen, and let the crystal-clear recording of their cold transactional threats from the night before play out loud for the entire lounge to hear. My father's face drained of color. My mother's mouth fell open in absolute horror. The private curtain they used to hide their abuse had been permanently ripped away in front of a dozen witnesses. The doctor's notes explicitly state that I am to maintain strict isolation from domestic stressors, I said, looking at my mother one last time. I am following medical advice. Security, please escort these people out of my sight. It was almost fascinating watching their faces crumble. For years, they had called me dramatics, unstable, and overly emotional. They had used those labels like handcuffs to keep me compliant. But now, a formal medical directive and a room full of uniform-wearing witnesses had turned my boundaries into something they couldn't mock without looking completely monstrous. My father attempted one last desperate glare, his jaw working silently, but the security guard took a meaningful step forward, cutting off his path. My sister turned on her heel, muttering something about how ungrateful I was, while my mother simply stood there, looking betrayed, as if my choice to survive was an act of malice directed entirely at her. They had to walk out themselves. They walked down that long, bright hospital hallway under the steady, judgmental gaze of the medical staff, stripped of their privacy, their leverage, and their control. When the heavy glass doors finally clicked shut behind them, a violent tremor ran through my entire body. My knees weakened, and I had to sit back down on the lounge chair. But beneath the shaking, for the very first time in my 26 years of life, I felt a strange, beautiful sensation. Relief. Absolute, unadulterated relief. A few minutes later, Julian walked into the lounge, carrying a paper bag from a quiet bakery down the street. He didn't offer a dramatic speech or push me for details. He just handed me a warm cup of herbal tea and sat in the chair opposite mine, giving me the space to simply exist without needing to perform. Your Uber is downstairs whenever you're ready, Nora, he said softly. And if you need someone to help you change the locks on your apartment door today, just say the word. Thank you, Julian, I whispered, and as I took a sip of the tea, the warmth spreading through my chest, I realized that a stranger had shown me more basic human dignity in 24 hours than my own flesh and blood had provided in a lifetime. That was 3 weeks ago. Today, I am sitting in my own small apartment. The windows are open. A gentle afternoon breeze is rustling the leaves of the new potted ivy I bought for the sill. And there is a stack of dirty dishes in my sink. For the first time in my life, I don't hear my mother's critical, venomous voice echoing in my head, demanding that I clean them. I sleep through the hours when my family usually hosts their frantic Sunday dinners. I go to my therapy appointments every Tuesday morning, unlearning the toxic programming they spent decades installing inside my mind. My phone still buzzes occasionally from unknown numbers. My mother sent one final message last night that read, "I miss my daughter." I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling a dull ache in my heart, but my hand didn't shake. I typed out one final, permanent reply. I miss the mother I needed. Then I blocked the number. I didn't win this battle by screaming, throwing tantrums, or trying to ruin their business. My revenge was much quieter, much cleaner, and entirely permanent. I simply removed myself as their scapegoat. I stopped being available for harm. For people like my family, losing access to the person they used to control is the heaviest punishment imaginable. So, I want to ask you honestly, as we sit here together at the end of this journey, do you think a family like mine is ever truly sorry for the pain they cause? Or are they just terrified because they finally lost their power? And if you were standing in my shoes today, would you ever open that door again? Or would you protect the peace you almost lost your breath trying to find? Take a deep breath for me. You deserve the air you take up.